Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop hosted by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis, I'm one of the Writing Support Center faculty, and today we're going to be talking about how to use summaries effectively. As with all of our workshops, we do have an accompanying worksheet. So if you are doing this workshop for extra credit, and you want to show your professor, hey, I attended this workshop, I watched it, feel free to do that worksheet, and that'll count as your proof that you came and watched it. In the module, we also have a couple of handouts that basically have all of the information that we're going to be talking about today. So if you ever need an extra point of reference, feel free to check out those handouts. So we're going to be talking about the difference between summary and analysis. So what is summary and how is it different from analysis? And then how do we avoid inappropriate summary in an academic paper? So the act of summarizing something that you've read, seen, or heard is very valuable. We're not saying that you shouldn't use it. However, there are specific times where you should be using it, and it should, but it should be balanced. So your summary shouldn't be your entire paper. And a lot of the times, one of the biggest transitions that we have as writers is from going from telling the reader this is what happened to going beyond that and adding something a little more complex, adding your personal thoughts about what you just read about the book, the article that you're summarizing, etc. So we're going to be talking about those differences between summary and analysis, and then also like how to identify excessive summary and replace that excessive summary with analysis in your academic paper. So what is summary, and is it a bad thing? So a summary is the retelling of information in a concise form, and it tends to answer the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So when someone asks you to summarize, like, give me the TLDR, the too long didn't read, version of a book or of a movie, they're just asking you to give them the important details, and that's what a summary is. You're just trying to tell your reader or your audience the important information about this this piece of work that you want them to take away. So that's not a bad thing. Summary is really useful to for yourself. You know, it helps you process and understand material that you have just read. So when you're able to summarize an article or something that you just read for class, it shows that you're understanding the material, and it also helps you kind of it helps you process that information and commit it to memory a little better. It also allows you to figure out what you know about the topic and decide on an essay topic. So this is really helpful for pre-writing. So when you're pre-writing, you know, we ask that you figure out what you already know and what information you're missing. And that missing information is a guide for what you need to do research on. So when you're summarizing, you're able to figure out like, oh, I already know this is the information I'm missing, these are the questions I still have, and it kind of helps in that sense. So it's a really good pre-writing tool. And then in your actual writing, so once you're actually getting down to your essay, it's really good to provide your reader with context. So it's summary in your intro paragraph and in your conclusion is really helpful to provide your reader with some background information that they need to know before you get into the actual body of the essay. And it helps them, it just helps them put things into perspective. So, you know, a little bit of summary is good and it's very helpful to have in your essay. However, it shouldn't be the whole essay, because at the end of the day, your professor is looking for what are your thoughts on the work that you read or you watched. and they want to really see how you construct your argument. So one thing that I always recommend is to have your to have a balance of the two, and you want to aim to have 10% of your paper be summary, and then 90% of your paper be analysis. So again, the summary shouldn't be a lot of the essay. It should actually be very minimal. So 10% summary, 90% analysis. And an example of including summary in a paper that's appropriate would be when you're introducing an article. Like you want to include who's the writer, you want to include what they studied and what their main point is. All of that could take 1-2 sentences at the most, but it shouldn't take a whole paragraph to explain it, because you're not trying to tell the reader every little thing that they discussed. You're just trying to take the main point, and then you're telling us, did they do an effective job at explaining that main point? Why is it tempting to summarize? So you might find that sometimes when you're writing your essay, during those first initial drafts, it can be a little intimidating to get straight into the analysis, and you find yourself going into the summary. And this is very understandable. And for the reason for that is because summary can feel like the easiest place to start, because you are very familiar with what you just read. It's easier to relate a plot or summarize an author's main points, because it's there. You already have that information right on hand. Whereas analysis is something that you're creating. You're creating your argument. You're creating your viewpoint on something that's already written. And that act of creating information, creating knowledge, is very difficult for anyone. So that's part of the reason why it's very tempting to summarize, because at the end of the day, repeating what the author says is always going to feel more approachable than trying to put into words, well, what do I think about this work that I watched or I read? So as we go on, we have to consider, how do we write more analytically? And so one of the things to consider is that focusing on certain parts of the reading. So if you're referencing an article or if you're referencing a book, think about what you want your thesis to be and choosing specific parts that are going to support that thesis. Because at the end of the day, that's what your quotes should be doing, is they should be supporting your thesis. And that'll help you kind of steer away from summary and be able to provide more analysis. A tip that I have found very useful for myself and for other students is that if the essay prompt is given to you ahead of time, so say at the beginning of the unit, your professor gives you the essay prompt before you start any of the readings, reference that essay prompt as you read the articles in your unit. The reason for this is so that way, as you're reading, one, you already have an understanding of what the essay prompt is asking for, so you can already start creating some sample theses, or start thinking like, oh, this is what they're asking me for. So then when you're reading, you can actually focus the way that you read by trying to find quotes that support that essay prompt and how you think you can answer it. This just helps reduce the time that you're going to spend when you're actually writing the essay. It's going to reduce the amount of time that you're searching through the reading, trying to find quotes that best support your thesis. So if you do that, if your essay prompt is assigned to you ahead of time and you're already kind of keeping that essay prompt in mind while you're reading, it's just going to help you build that analysis when the time comes. So how to tell if you're summarizing. So like I said, it's really easy to fall into summary, and summary is good, but it shouldn't be your whole essay. So there are a couple strategies to use if you want to make sure, like if you know that this is a habit that you have, like, oh, I do have a habit of summarizing a lot as opposed to putting more analysis. you know, there are some strategies that you can use to catch yourself in that moment. So one is if you find yourself starting sentences with certain phrases. So for example, saying this book is about, this essay is the story of, this author writes about, the movie is set in. If you find yourself kind of doing any of those type of starting points, chances are that you're going into a summary. And so, like I mentioned earlier, a little bit of summary isn't a bad thing, but it really shouldn't be extending more than 2 sentences. And if you find that your entire paragraph, that sentence started an entire paragraph of summary, then you want to find the information that you don't need and take it out. When you're going through your essay, so this should be happening during the revision process. So we always say that writing is multiple acts. Your first draft shouldn't be your final one. So when you're going through your essay, some questions to ask yourself, to determine whether or not you're summarizing is, am I stating something that would be obvious to the reader or the viewer? So when you're adding analysis, it shouldn't be obvious. That information shouldn't be obvious to the reader or your audience if they're familiar with that work. If it is obvious, chances are that you're just paraphrasing information that was mentioned in the article or the essay. Does my essay move through the plot, history, or author's argument in chronological order or in the exact same order the author used? So again, when you're constructing your own academic paper, your flow, your order of paragraphs should be a little different than what is presented in the article, because you're constructing your own thoughts on how that on the author's opinion, on the author's argument. And so sometimes you don't need to go in chronological order of the author's paper in order to state your ideas. So if you find that you're going in exact order, you might be actually summarizing as opposed to providing your own analysis. Am I describing what happens, where it happens, or whom it happens to? Again, summary answers the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so these questions, whether you're just describing these 3 things, is basically relating back to those ideas. So if you're answering yes to any of these, chances are that you have a lot of summary in your paper. So you want to be mindful of that. Whereas the questions below, so over here in the light green box, these questions are to determine whether you have more analysis. And if your answer is yes to any of these questions, then chances are that you have more analysis, which is what we want in your paper. So am I making an original argument about the text? Again, you don't want the details that you're bringing up to be too obvious, because your argument should be specific to you and what you think about the reading. Have I arranged my evidence around my points rather than just following the author's or the plot's order? Again, the way that you order your essay should be best suited for your thesis, not to relay how the author created their article. Am I explaining why or how an aspect of the text is significant? So one thing that I always say is that analysis should answer the why, it should answer the how, and it should answer the so what. And so whenever you're presenting a quote, if you're able to answer the why, the how, or the so what in your analysis, then that means that you have a thorough analysis, as opposed to if you're just saying how the author did something. You really want to be describing impact. You want to be telling like the reader what your thoughts are about that quote. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, there is an accompanying handout for this workshop. So this activity is going to be found on the accompanying worksheet. And so on that worksheet, there's a sample introductory paragraph that is filled with a lot of summary. Which details are considered summary? In the space below that intro paragraph, be sure to write which details would be considered summary, which ones can you keep to provide context, and which ones can you keep to provide context to the reader. So as we mentioned, not all summary is bad, but not all summary is necessary. So what information do you need based off of that intro paragraph? What information do we need to have enough information for our reader to be able to go through the essay having an understanding of what the book is about? Right. So how to incorporate more analysis. So this is a question that I get a lot. So oftentimes the students that have a lot of summary in their essays aren't really sure how to incorporate more analysis. Again, analysis is a little more intimidating because you are creating knowledge and you're communicating your knowledge to a reader. So that's definitely a little scarier than as opposed to just trying to repeat what the author is saying. So one of the things to consider is like, well, and what analysis is. So again, analysis is the act of creating knowledge. It's a process of taking different pieces of a reading and explaining how they work together and why they are important. So again, we're answering the why and the how. So that's what analysis really is. Analysis is really very much just answering, why is this important? How does this work together? And the so what are you trying to prove? Or so what should we care about this? Ideally, this should be done while you're reading. So one of the things in a previous workshop, we talked about annotation. And annotation is the act of dialogue between you and a text. You're highlighting things, you're determining like what could be useful, you're creating your thoughts as you read. And so that process is really important because that's really where you start creating a lot of your analysis, because you're not just reading an article for the sake of reading it. You're reading an article to start formulating your opinion about the author's argument. So while you're reading, you should really be taking notes of any themes, main ideas, and how the writer is trying to convince you that they are right. As we mentioned earlier, analytic writing goes beyond the obvious. So when you're writing your analysis, you should be trying to answer the why is this important? So what are they trying to prove? And then that how aspect that we talked about above here, how does this work with the other main points that you're talking about in your thesis? And then over here on the right, there's some additional steps to practice analysis. So one strategy is to identify evidence that supports or illustrates the main point or theme, as well as anything that seems to contradict it. So again, in your reading, make sure to identify things, select points that you feel support your thesis, but then also trying to think of counter arguments that might be happening, and addressing those counter arguments and still trying to prove how you are right. Decide whether the sources used are trustworthy. So again, if we're trying to say that there's like fallacies or the argument isn't really logical, always going back to the sources. If the sources are reliable or not, that can help. That could be a point of discussion in your analysis. Identify the work's underlying assumptions about the subject, as well as any biases it reveals. So every writer has pre-existing thoughts and ideas when they're writing their essays, when they're writing their articles. They're writing to prove a point, they're writing for a certain audience. How does that affect the way that they've constructed their argument? And that could be a good talking point in your essay. can you or a friend answer what's my point or what's my argument? So this is a really good strategy if you have a friend who has some time to be able to help you with your essay. You can also ask your tutor, like, I want to make sure that you can answer what's my point and what's my argument. So a tutor can help you with this part as well, because if you're not able to answer those questions, if there isn't a clear argument, then chances are you might be having more summary than needed. And then lastly, another reason that we want you to consider analysis is because, so we always get that question, like, or we always get this statement of 7 pages is a lot of writing. I don't know how I can do it. Well, a lot of that writing comes from your analysis. So if you're just summarizing, that's part of the reason why it feels a little harder to reach the page limit, is because there's only so much information you can repeat. However, if you're telling us what your thoughts are, if you're answering these 2 questions along with this question over here, that's a lot of information that you can include in your essay, and that's going to help your essay get longer. So analysis is very important for a lot of different reasons, and we want to make sure that you are adding that in, so that way you can have a stronger essay. There's also strategies to help avoid excessive summary. I'm sorry that this thing up here is kind of blocking the top part of the text. I apologize for that. So one strategy is a strategy that we've actually talked about a couple times already, and it's as soon as you get your prompt, be sure to read it, have an understanding of it. Ask questions about it. You know, you can ask your professor additional questions. You can also ask a tutor, and our tutors are more than happy to help you understand your essay prompt a lot more. And the reason for that is because your essay prompt it's the guide for your essay. So if you're having a good understanding of it, means that your essay will be on the right track, because your professor is telling you what they want you to do in that essay prompt. So be sure to reread it before you start writing, and then keep going back to it while you write. Also, most essay prompts tend to have questions, and those questions can help you add analysis into your essay. A second strategy to avoid excessive summary is be sure to create a strong thesis, and making sure that your essay is revolving around that thesis. So the reason why excessive summary isn't always helpful is because sometimes you mention details that aren't supporting that thesis. So if you have a thesis and you keep that thesis in mind, you're able to choose points from the article, from the reading, that are going to support that thesis. And so that's why some summary is good. It's good when it's supporting, adding context for your thesis. So be sure to use that. And again, that information should be used as evidence for your argument. Once again, having a dialogue, be sure to, with your reading, be sure to highlight, annotate, highlight and annotate as you read, and keep in mind these types of questions. What parts do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What questions do you have? Does it remind you of other things that you've read or seen? All of this is information that you can include as analysis in your essay. Making sure that you have a clear topic sentence. So again, going back to this second point, if you have a clear thesis, you should be able to have clear topic sentences. And then you're able to determine what pieces of evidence that you need from the reading in order to include, to avoid summarizing the whole thing. If you want additional information on how to do this, we do have a we do have a workshop in our Canvas page on how to write paragraphs, and part of that is creating a strong topic sentence. This strategy is best for after you have your first draft finished. So use 2 different highlighters to mark your paper. So one color would be to highlight areas of summary or description, and then the other would be to highlight areas of analysis. So say, for example, if you're using yellow for summary and then green for your analysis, if you notice that a lot of your paper is yellow, then that means that you have a lot of summary, and you have to take some of those pieces and turn them into analysis. We mentioned earlier that you should aim to have 10% summary, 90% analysis. So this is a physical way that you can visualize that to make sure that you're having only 10% summary and 90% analysis. And then lastly, avoid adding details that are obvious to the reader. Again, analysis shouldn't be obvious. So if it's something that's been clearly stated in the reading, and if you feel like it's not really adding much to your argument, to your thesis, then maybe it's best to not include it. Right. So with those strategies in mind, go back to the worksheet and go back to that sample intro paragraph that was in the first activity. In the space provided, use the summary and details to rewrite the paragraph to include more analysis and a thesis. Remember to answer the how, the why, or the so what in your thesis, and when adding analysis. You can use strategies that were mentioned in this video. So feel free to, you can pause this, you can rewind it back to some of those other strategies that we talked about, and we're just trying to make this paragraph into something that's has more analysis as opposed to being all summary. And then some of you might be in journalism classes and you might be asked to write a review. So a review is a type of writing where the writer has to tell the reader whether or not something that they read or watched was good or not. So, for those kinds of situations, some people might think, well, I have to summarize for this because I'm trying to tell the reader whether or not it's worth their time. However, you actually don't want to give too much, you don't want to give away too much of the plot because otherwise someone who's reading it might say, well, I already know what it's about, so what's the point in going to see it, or what's the point in reading it? So even for a review, you want to avoid too much summary. We want to, instead, what we want is to describe specific parts that were good or interesting and explain why or how the author or the director accomplished this. So for example, if the writing was really suspenseful, how was it really suspenseful? Is it like through their use of adjectives? Was it through their use of like scary imagery? So how did the writer or the director achieve that certain emotion for you? As always, if you're not sure how to proceed forward, feel free to ask your professor. Your professor has more experience with this kind of writing, so they might be able to provide you with some more information. And then lastly, if you're reviewing like a book or an article, it's always better to just summarize the main ideas and then just give an overview of how they organized it. So there is some summary, but again, it shouldn't be the whole thing, because at the end of the day, you're trying to convince the reader whether it's good or whether it's bad. All right. And that is all for today. Thank you all so much for watching and for sticking through. Once again, if this is for extra credit, be sure to fill out the accompanying worksheet because that'll qualify as like your proof that you watched this workshop. These were some of the works that were consulted in the creation of this workshop. This workshop is actually an adaptation for this article on the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's Writing Center online Writing Center page called Summary, Using It Wisely. You can find the link to that page on the module. So if you also want to reference something without bringing up this particular video, that's totally fine. You can just click on that link and it'll take you to the page, and it's basically all of the same information that we discussed. And then these were the readings that they used. If you want to schedule an appointment, you can to meet with the tutor. You know, you have an essay finished and you want to make sure that you have enough analysis and that you're not summarizing too much. Feel free to follow this link in order to be able to schedule a session with the tutor. We have appointments available as early as 8 a.m. to as late as 7 p.m. or 6:30 p.m. is the last hour that you can select for a session. All sessions must be scheduled by 5 p.m. the day before. Unfortunately, we do not offer same-day appointments in order to provide our tutors with time to prepare for their sessions. If at any time you need to contact somebody, you know, you're having trouble accessing your appointment, this is the phone number that our staff is currently using. Feel free to call that number and they will be able to assist you and walk you through. If you have a question that's maybe a little less urgent, feel free to email the Writing Support Center at pasadena.edu, and a faculty member will be sure to respond to you as soon as they can. Thank you very much. Please continue to stay safe, and we hope to continue seeing you in future sessions and workshops. Thank you.